NATO is 75 years old. According to its official history, it was founded to deter the expansion of the Soviet Union, forbid the revival of nationalist militarism in Europe through a strong American presence on the continent, and encourage European political integration. Today, there is a European Union, reasonably integrated politically. Nationalist militarism is not a serious European problem, though I'm not sure Americans in Paris have had much to do with that, and the Soviet Union lies in the dust heap of history. That phrase, by the way, was first made famous by Leon Trotsky in 1917. For those foreign policy listeners who speak Russian, I know we have a few, the phrase Trotsky used was musorny yashchik, which also can be translated as dustbin, garbage heap, ash heap, and trash heap. But I digress. Not for the first time, I know. The successor state to the Soviet Union is the Russian Federation. It's ruled by Vladimir Putin, who is right now waging a brutal and criminal war. I think it's also fair to call it a nationalist militarist war against Ukraine, which is not a NATO country, but which has borders with NATO countries. So, how is NATO holding up after all these years? Was this week's NATO summit in Washington a birthday party for a spry septuagenarian, or more like Weekend at Bernie's? And for our younger listeners, I know we have a few of those too, that was a very funny 1989 movie about a party for a guy who happened to be deceased, though most of the celebrants didn't notice that about him. Other jokes occur to me, but I will restrain myself. I can't promise the same for Brad Bowman, Senior Director of FDD's Center on Military and Political Power, and retired Admiral Mark Montgomery, Senior Director of FDD's Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation. They're with us today. I'm Cliff May. I'm pleased you're with us, too, here on Foreign Policy. Well, just start with, is there any other relevant, I just gave a little history, is there any other relevant history of NATO that a listener should know?
So, let me take that up. So I was in U.S. European Command as a flag officer in the 2010s, at a time when, and I would say, you said 75 years old, I'd say at this point, 75 years young. Mm-hmm. I think that the biggest thing I'd say is that go back to 2021 when Macron called NATO brain dead.
I remember.
2018, President Trump had a very bad meeting at the NATO headquarters, then President Trump, complaining about things. I think legitimately in that case, about failure of Europeans to spend the right amount 10 years into their pledge.
Yeah.
Which I know Brad will probably go into. What I would say is things have changed dramatically. What I would say is this is a very different NATO than the NATO of 3 years ago, a stronger, vibrant, responsible NATO that I think is in a much better position now than they were just 3 years ago. And the credit for that belongs to the United States. It belongs to the current Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, and it belongs to Vladimir Putin. Those three things have come together to, I think, really strengthen it. So I think NATO in the 2010s was on the decline. We were basically, my job was to help produce Eastern European forces to go fight alongside us in Iraq and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. That was that was not one of the three missions you laid out pretty succinctly there at the beginning. And I think in a way, while that was important to have our allies support us in that fight, that was not near as important as what we're doing in Ukraine, because the central thesis of Ukraine is the defense of Europe against an rapacious authoritarian. So I really think NATO is back on target, back on mission. And so I do think there's a historical sweep since the 2010s till now that it all trends in the right direction.
Fair to say, though, that NATO, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and for good reason, took a peace dividend, took a holiday from history. I think that a lot of the Europeans, particularly the West Europeans, some are still thinking this way, thought if there's no Soviet Union, well, there's no reason for a military alliance. What's the point?
All three of us remember the phrase, and Mark touched on this a little bit, that NATO had to go out of area to remain in business. We had to go find missions. We had to go find missions to they never said it quite this way, to justify its existence. So some were very happy to go help in Afghanistan because that kind of, proved that they were still relevant and helpful. But I would say now more than ever, the foundational purposes of NATO are clear, and that is preventing Russian invasion / aggressions against NATO members. And in the in the summit declaration that was released this week, they made clear that the number one conventional threat to the alliance is Russia. And so my perception is that Americans and Europeans need NATO more than ever. And NATO needs America more than ever. That's why there's a lot of concern right now about by dignitaries visiting Washington about what the future holds here in Washington, depending who wins the election. One other quick thing that the summit highlighted was that this is the most successful alliance in history. It says that the alliance says that about itself. Historians can debate that. We need Donald Kagan in the room. If we could bring him back to discuss these issues, maybe hyperbole there, but undoubtedly successful if you define success for a collective defense alliance in saying that no member has faced, since its establishment in 1949, a conventional assault.
So I'm not sure I disagree with you. I probably do agree with you, but let me push back anyhow and make you defend some of those propositions. It's nice to say what a successful alliance it is. The Soviet Union collapsed. And yes, it's natural for the NATO to say, well, you see that? That's because we were here. And I'm not sure that's the reason the Soviet Union collapsed. And secondly, I think this is an important part to think. On the left and not least on the right, there are definitely factions, we'll talk about who they are, that want to reduce the U.S. commitment to NATO, that want to draw down of U.S. forces. Let's, for listeners who may be skeptical, try to articulate why it is in the American interest to lead, not just support NATO.
Oh, thanks, Cliff. No, it's a fundamental question. With deference to you, frankly, because I think you know more about that topic than I do, I would say there are probably a whole bunch of reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed. And I would not put NATO in the top 2 or 3. But that doesn't mean it's not the most successful alliance in history. Okay. So I think your point can be true and mine can be true at the same time. I would give Reagan a lot of credit for the collapse of the Soviet Union. I would give Eastern Europeans a lot of credit. The role of the Catholic Church in Eastern Europe, there's lots of explanations for that. But at risk of oversimplifying, the ideology behind the Soviet Union was one of expansion. There was an expansion, and you say this so often, of imperialism and ideological expansion. And when the Soviet Union tried to expand, they ran into all sorts of impediments and speed bumps. And one of those impediments and speed bumps, at least in the conventional military realm, the leading impediment was the North Atlantic Treaty. So when the Soviets pushed forward with their bayonet, they hit something hard, and that something hard was NATO. Now, someone come from the right in this country might say, okay, that's nice, Brad. Well, what made that NATO wall so hard? It was American power. Yeah, that's right. Sure. Okay, fine. And that served our fundamental interest because, regional wars in Europe, there was 2 of those in the first half of the 20th century. They were called world wars, and both of which America were brought into. More than 500,000 Americans lost their lives. So for a fraction of what we spend on our overall defense, we are deterring aggression that sooner or later would involve Americans. So that's why I've said over and over again, I think it's a wise investment and not charity to support NATO.
So, I'll go a little further. I'll say I do think NATO was a top 1 or 2 reason why the Soviet Union collapsed. I think Peter Schweitzer and others have written extensive books on how our spending, and back then, we were spending 4.5% of GDP. I know it's hard to remember these days, back in the 1980s. And the Europeans were spending higher percentages in the 3 to 4%. That combined effort, of which the Europeans were 40%, and they were 72% of specific NATO spending, and we were 28%, and that's historically been the numbers. They were with us. We spent, whether it was SDI, naval, the buildup of the U.S. Navy to 600 ships, the simultaneous development of the Abrams, Apache, Bradley, and Patriot, the Army's heyday of acquisition, all that stuff happened in the mid-1980s. The air-land battle, that was a U.S. NATO kind of way of fighting. All that came in and pressurized the Russian system. And then we did a lot of intelligence agency activities to make it hard for them to get cash and, sell gold, things like that. A lot of things went on. I believe at its core, whether you call it the United States-led Western enterprise or NATO, is fatally weakened the Soviet Union to a degree that when pressurized, it collapsed. So I do give the Western security apparatus, whether you call it NATO or not, credit for what happened to the Soviet Union.
And I think that's fair. And also, there, the unbearable lightness of history is you have to think about what didn't happen that might have happened. And this the right understood better than the left back then. Although Roosevelt sort of got it in terms of who his last vice president was, Truman, not Wallace, right? Wallace, because the Soviet Union was, as you say, imperialist, expansionist. It is a terrible tragedy that nations that were under the domination of the Nazis for a number of years ended up not being freed by World War II, but ended up under the domination of the Soviets, who were not much better. I'm not sure that's a whole other debate, who was worse. And it took finally the collapse of the Soviet Union to free Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, all these various nations. So what didn't happen, NATO gets credit for that too, if you think of it that way.
A quick comment. I think that's right. And what Mark said, I agree with that. I guess to try to say more clearly what I was trying to say earlier, if you look at the job number one of a collective defense alliance, right, is to deter aggression against the alliance. So if that's the job of a collective defense alliance, it totally knocked it out of the park. Grand slam home run. That's my point. And your rebuttal, which I welcome, was, well, how responsible was it for toppling and transforming the threat? And I said maybe 3 or 4. Mark says 1 or 2. I'd say, well, that's above and beyond. That's extra credit for the student. If not only can you perform your core task of preventing aggression against the members, but you've also played some role in toppling and transforming the threat and making it essentially go away in some form. Holy cow, that's extra credit. That's how I'd say it.
Yeah. And I do want to stipulate, I agree, you should not pick a Soviet sympathizer as your vice president.
And that's who he had as his first vice president.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people thought, and again, to be fair, the Soviets were our allies in World War II. Therefore, the Soviets are our friends. We can get along with them. I think, from what I understand, even Roosevelt didn't have a terribly clear picture of Stalin. I think there's some quote by him, Stalin, that old crow, I can deal with him.
I think
you remember
Patton
that?
had a little clearer view.
Who's that?
I think Patton
did.
had a little clearer view.
But Roosevelt did by 37, 38. And, I get that Arm& Hammer was selling a load of crap in the
well, more than that, I think he was a spy.
Yeah, and likely, but certainly he was a fellow traveler.
Yeah.
But I think just like we knew about the Holocaust in 41, 42, we knew about the Soviet purges in 37, 38. So we knew who we were dealing with here. Just back then, I think authoritarian regimes were more the norm than the exception. And so there was probably a little more understanding of a little less criticism of Stalin internally. If he was your enemy's enemy, you could live with him.
Well, I mean, this is a digression, but it's an interesting one. If you think about the history of the Communist Party USA, they had difficulties, particularly when Stalin made a pact with Hitler to divide up Poland. And there were those American communists, a lot of them in places like Hollywood, nice people who were, who were shocked, and actually some of them gave up their membership in the Communist Party, or were no longer fellow travelers once Stalin made that pact with Hitler. Now, Hitler went back on that pact, and then Stalin, and as we know the history, Stalin was very shocked by that, and was not very effective for quite some time after that, and then eventually. Right, you remember all that, but I still think there were plenty of people, and there were even after World War II who thought, okay, we had this alignment, this alliance with they were the Allies. We should be able to continue it, and there was a huge controversy for years over who was responsible for the Cold War. Was it the Soviets or was it us? Remember that? I remember that.
You remember there was a reason the Soviets insisted on Ribbentrop being executed, right?
And this is right. Ribbentrop was just people. We're talking about when I say Stalin and Hitler, the pact was the Ribbentrop-Molotov, and those were the foreign ministers of the two respective countries.
And at Nuremberg, they really insisted that we execute him. He was a war criminal, so not a big deal. But he certainly wasn't there to write any memoirs when it was over. We're way off of NATO here, Cliff.
Okay, let me get back to NATO. So, FD's Richard Goldberg has a piece out this week. We're in full disclosure, recording this Thursday afternoon for release Friday night. He writes, NATO now needs American leadership, a plan to modernize, and a strategy for victory. Our NATO leaders this week coming up with a plan to modernize and a strategy for victory.
I respect Rich's writing. I think he's probably a little overly critical here. I think there is a plan to modernize. Jens Stoltenberg is the singular best leader of NATO we've had I believe, in 75 years.
We should note he's
retiring at the end. He's retiring at the end of 10 years now, almost 10 years, I think, as Secretary General. And there is a plan. Look, what's happened is when I was at European Command working with NATO, we had these things called capability targets, where a country would sign up and say, I'll try to have 3 NASAM air defense batteries. I'll try to have 1 Patriot. Now there's much more of you'll sign up and we'll stay on top of you and you will deliver. And we're starting to see countries actually have cash. 2 or 3 defense ministers were saying today, I want to get up to 3%, but I can't because I literally can't buy things. And they won't even give me a contract where I could put the money down for a future purchase because they don't know the speed at which they can do it. Countries are buying their capabilities as fast as the defense industrial base will allow them. They're in there. We're not perfect. We still have 32 NATO countries, certainly shouldn't have 32 navies, but they also, which they don't, but they shouldn't have 20, which they do. Probably they need 8 or 9. You know what I mean? We don't need 32 air forces. We probably need 32 armies, minus the Icelanders, I guess, with 31 armies. My point on this is we still have some inefficiencies, but NATO is modernizing. NATO is, collectively the most modern organ. When you look at it singularly, the United States is the most modern military in the world. If you looked at NATO collectively, it's probably maybe the Israeli military is collectively as modern as NATO's military, but that's a close run race, and that's it. That would be the top. And Japan's probably in that group too. NATO is modern. NATO has capability gaps. NATO is spending a metric butt ton of money. Where I will really agree, double down with Rich that he's right, is NATO does not have a theory of victory in Ukraine. Right. The Biden administration does not have a theory of victory in Ukraine. Zelensky has a theory of victory in Ukraine. Some of us can embrace that, but I would not include Joe Biden's not my fellow traveler on that.
But his theory of victory has to do with hitting the Russians at home
and
right?
Reclaiming Crimea, reclaiming Donetsk, the eastern Ukraine that they've lost, and restoring the territorial integrity of his country to its 2014 borders.
Is it not a failure of NATO that Putin was not deterred, or is that purely a failure of, specifically Biden and I would say Obama, because after all, the first Russian invasion of Ukraine was 2014, the taking of Crimea. After that, Obama tried very hard to say, let's let bygones be bygones. Let's have the reset was after that, right? Yeah. The reset of relations.
No, the reset was before.
The reset was before. That was after George in 2008. Okay,
so let me take a whack at this, and then I know Brad will want to too. The first thing I'd say is it was not a failure of NATO because NATO is explicitly not about the defense of non-NATO states. It was a failure of the NATO member states who had an overarching interest in European security. So the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Poland, probably you throw Romania and Bulgaria, and then the countries that have real proximate interests. Yeah. We collectively did not show, because there's always 2 things going on in Europe. There's always the NATO treaty alliance, which really gets you capabilities, gets you what Rich is worried about, those capabilities, technology, modernization. But then there's the coalition of the willing that gets stuff done, right? And that get stuff done group did not push back hard enough after 2014 and loss of Crimea. And that goes through the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. Obama gave 0 kinetic tools.
Lethal tools.
Even despite being told javelins are really, really necessary, transferred 0.
Despite congressional Republicans pounding on his door on
demanding
a basis to do so. And I had a second row seat to that. And it was so frustrating how insistent they were on not providing lethal assistance. And the fundamental reason was provocation.
But it might have deterred them.
We don't want to. It might have worked. We'll never know. We'll never know. We never tested the hypotheses. But the reason the Obama administration didn't, it's really this simple. They didn't want to, quote unquote, provoke Putin for something he was already planning to do.
This strategy of don't provoke Putin, don't provoke the Iranians, don't provoke this.
Don't provoke.
Very bad strategy, which we've had.
It's consistently wrong.
It's consistently
wrong. And Brad's
wrong.
written about this extensively. I'll go forward. Look, President Trump did say early on, I'm going to give him kinetics. And we did eventually, after about 2 years, give javelins, a few other things. It then got held up by his kind of messy intervention in Ukrainian politics, has to do with participation of, Hunter Biden in a company. And, we all know that kind of sordid history of both presidential candidates now involved in there. But it stopped. For the purpose of this discussion, it stopped U.S. lethal aid. But then it restarted near the end of the administration. And again, the Biden administration, very low-key lethal aid for about 6 months, 8 months. Then after the Afghan withdrawal and that debacle, which also contributed to Putin going, the administration started to realize, oh my, this is a real event going on down there. Putin's going to take advantage of this. And they did step up and they gave about $1 billion worth of assistance over about a 7-month period leading up to February of the invasion in February 2022. So I'll just say 3 presidents in a row allowed this to happen.
Cliff, if I may, going back to Rich's comment, Rich is a friend and I agree with him on a lot. I would give NATO a little bit more credit than he does, just very quickly running through some numbers. So money, posture, plan, and procurement money, 23 of 32 NATO allies will meet this year the 2% of gross domestic product floor minimum on defense spending. 23 of 32. So that is not, how does that compare? It was 3 in 2014.
Yeah.
It was 6 in 2021. It's 23 this year. That's a very positive improvement. But a critic might say, well, what the heck? What about the other 9? What about the other 9? More than 2 years after Putin's invasion? What the heck? And that's legitimate. But let's call balls and strikes. 23 is a heck of a lot better than 3. Yeah. Okay. And that's real money. And by the way, in 2024, how much of an increase do we see from all the other allies other than the United States? 18%. In 2024, this year, there's an 18% increase in non-U.S. defense spending. That's a big deal. That's a lot of weapons. That's a lot of capability.
1%. Yeah. Now, we spend a lot of money, but because of a budget deal we did, we're going to be 1%. I think Wicker will get a little bump in that, so it might be 2%. Yeah, but that's it.
Yeah, and then on posture, posture, particularly as Mark knows so well from his previous job, the combat power in Eastern Europe is dramatically improved. We've had a doubling of the battle groups deployed in Eastern Europe. I mean, real combat power, and much of that, maybe even most of it, is European. And associated with those forward position ready combat forces are new plans that say, hey, you country with this unit are responsible for this ground. You focus on it, you learn the ground, you get ready to defend it. Very, very positive. And by the way, now that the alliance is larger, 32 members, including Finland and Sweden, 2 very capable partners that are now added, they're being integrated into the war plans that makes the alliance more ready and creates dilemmas for Russian military planners. And then lastly, procurement. A very laudable effort is underway to integrate our defense industrial bases to try to make all of them more productive individually and collectively. And we also saw a very tangible pledge of long-term security assistance for Ukraine at a minimum for next year of $40 billion in euros annually. Should it be more? Yes, but establishing real standards and holding our European allies accountable to it. So, is it enough? No. Is it positive? Yes. Does more need to be done? Yes. But that's where
I love that Ukraine one. At this point, to date, now we and the NATO Europeans have pledged more. To date, we've delivered $52.3 billion in military assistance and procurement.
This is, by the way, mostly weapons and munitions, not checks, right?
Correct.
Okay. People need to understand that.
By the way, the money never goes to Ukraine.
No.
The money goes to Texas, Arkansas. Brad's written about this repeatedly.
I know, but we got to repeat this because people don't get this. We're sending giving them blank checks. No, we're not giving them blank checks. Giving them guns.
48 or 49 billion of the 52 billion has been to U.S. companies in the U.S.
That need it.
That need it. And in fact, our companies no longer can even build here. They're literally asking, could we build some of this someplace else in Australia, and like a U.S. factory, not China, even in Ukraine. But okay, so we're 52.3. Europe is 50 billion. Non-US, that includes some non-NATO countries at the time, Sweden and Finland, who weren't at the time, but the totality of 50 billion. So they're right, they're matched up with us.
Yeah.
I mean, and our GDPs are the same.
Yeah.
Right? So this is, that we have to stop this language of this is us. Why, when are they going to step up? They've stepped up. They're with us. There are some freeloaders.
Canada is really bad under Trudeau. We got to call
he made a promise this today. He made a promise on Thursday.
Okay.
And that promise was, I'll get to 2% by 2032. Now, look, that's a good news, bad news thing. The good news, you finally made a promise, put a date on it. And the other good news is you won't be prime minister when it happens, most likely. But the bad news is that's, still 7.5 years from now.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Real quick, we talked about two things there, and just if helpful, Cliff, for the listeners, we were talking about NATO members spending what they should on their own defense, right? Which helps improve their defense industrial bases so they can make their militaries more capable and so that they can in turn carry more of the security burden and provide more to Ukraine. And then then Mark shifted very well to the how much has the United States provided to Ukraine. And that's a large part of this. And they're related, right? Because if we don't, and you've made this point, Cliff, if we don't defeat Putin's invasion of Ukraine or make it costly, it increases the chances that he'll push further and challenge a NATO member. And then you will have U.S. troops fighting. And just we updated a graphic, me, Ryan Brobst, and John Hardy recently, just a few more numbers, right? Because some of us still want to be empirical here. Look at the numbers. So wow, $54 billion in U.S. security systems. That's a lot of money. We could have spent that on bridges in West Virginia. Okay, well, how much is that compared to what? It's always a great question. Compared to what? That's roughly $54 billion. That's roughly 2.6% of what we spent on the Pentagon during the same period. So for 2.6% of what we spent on the Pentagon during the same period, we've helped the Ukrainians do what? Destroy over 9,600 Russian tanks and armored vehicles, destroy over 257 Russian aircraft, sink at least 26 Russian naval vessels, decrease the chances that Russia will push further into NATO, where you will have American troops fighting. Note to self, no American troops are fighting in Ukraine, and sending a very positive deterrent message to Beijing that America is not neutral in the face of naked aggression. And finally, where most of that money is going back to Arkansas and places like that, increasing our defense industrial base, employing Americans, and making sure that we have the defense industrial base to support our troops when they have to go fight somewhere else, whether it be the Middle East or the Indo-Pacific.
A good chunk of the $50 billion in European assistance is also going to Arkansas, Texas, and Georgia, because one of the sad things about the Europeans is their appetite for weapons exceeds their belly, their ability to produce right now. And so they are trying their hardest to build, they're trying their hardest to build weapons factories to restart them.
Some.
Oh, yeah, they
are.
are.
Which countries are?
France, for sure.
France,
and France is simultaneously, and they're bitching pretty heavily that the other Europeans are buying from America. Well, that's the only choice. So when they buy a weapon, when they give a weapon to the Ukrainians and want a new one bought back, they have to come to the United States for javelins, for 155, that's 155 Howard, artillery rounds, for guided missile launcher rounds from in attack, those types of weapons that they have given to the Ukrainians, Stingers, all those kind of things. They have to come to us. In fact, there was a $700 million deal inked this week. One thing I should say about NATO is there's the NATO summit, and there's all the cool stuff that happens alongside the NATO summit. So alongside the NATO summit, we signed a $700 million deal for Stingers. About 5 European countries are going to be buying $700 million worth of U.S. Stingers. They're Raytheon product, produced in the United States and Texas mostly.
Helping us restart some production lines.
Yeah. The line had been shut for 19 years at full-scale production. They'd done some limited production over that 19 years, but it had really been shut down because we weren't using Stingers. And then there was a deal for sharing icebreaker technology and knowledge between Canada, Finland, and the United States. But people don't know this. Finland doesn't have a lot of icebreakers. They build everyone's and design everyone's icebreakers. So now we're making deals to help us and the Canadians get better at icebreaker development and production.
Particularly important because both China and Russia want to take over the Arctic. That's also in their plans. It's another.
There's a third deal on air defense where 5 countries, United States, Romania, Italy, the Dutch, and us, agreed to give 4 Patriot systems and 1 Italian system called a SAMP-T and the hundreds of effectors, the missiles, to go with them, to them. And there's a subset to that deal of NASAMS, which is another air defense missile, and IRIS, which is another air defense missile, that are also going. So all this stuff, that's a side deal. There was a side deal on a cyber center, setting up a cyber defense center in Mons. There was a side deal on a NATO Innovation Fund to forward fund cybersecurity investments in quantum and AI kind of products were only for NATO countries. There's both an accelerator and an innovation fund to back startups. So all these things happen on the sidelines. What other alliance? The transactional alliance we're dealing with. Brad and I write about this all the time. North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran. I don't believe they have these kind of deep kind of meetings where they get together and decide, where are you weakest? Where am I strongest? Let's share these kind of things together. They do very transactional, like, you're short artillery rounds right now. I'll give them to you. You give me a space launch. It's a very militaristic.
Though it may develop. I want to be on guard for that. It'll evolve and mature.
And I think you'll see from us over the next year and a half deep studies on this issue from FDD.
I want to get back to that in a minute. I have a thought on that hopefully I'll remember. Before I do, we need to get this in. Zelensky comes here, and what he really wants, what Poland wants, is for the Ukraine to have a clear path into NATO. I would say they didn't get that, or did? Well, go ahead. What did you think?
I'm eager to hear from Mark as well in this, but yeah, I mean, in the all the public speeches, and most importantly in the summit declaration, I would say they were unambiguously clear that Ukraine will eventually be a member of NATO, and they are incredibly not clear of when. and the exact wording from this, if you read it carefully, it was when allies decide and when they are ready. And so, I mean, that is about as vague as you can be. So, yeah.
And I got to say, I don't quite, I think Ukraine, if they would win this war, would be a great member of NATO because they've actually fought the Russians and know how to fight the Russians and are willing to fight. All kinds of reasons they'd be a great contributor to the collective security. However, this gets back to what you hear from a lot of people with whom I argue that, poor Putin was afraid of NATO and we were trying to get Ukraine into NATO because NATO was expanding. And I think that was nonsense. First, because NATO was never aggressive. Second, because NATO is simply open to people want to join. It's a club. It's not imperialist. You want to join? Let us know. But most importantly, because Ukraine did want to join, anybody really think that Germany, when they were taking energy supplies from Russia, was going to vote for that? I don't. Anybody think Turkey was going to vote for that? I don't. Anybody think Hungary was going to vote for that? I don't. And it has to be unanimous. So I don't think there was ever a threat that Ukraine was actually going to be in NATO. And I think Putin's smart enough to know that. And I think it's hard to see how NATO goes in, especially if this war ends with a frozen conflict with a lot of, which it could, where parts of eastern Ukraine, Donbass, are still in Russian hands. There's all kinds of reasons why, yes, it's nice to say we see Ukraine's future in NATO, but I don't think it was realistic in the past for the reasons I said, and I don't think it's realistic in the foreseeable future.
Well, look, I do. They will be a member of NATO, not least of which because we can have no empathy for a bully here. If they don't join NATO, it means bullying tactics work. And this guy, look, sometimes we get a misunderstanding here. This isn't like, old Joe Biden, he misplayed Putin, blah, blah. That isn't what happened here. Putin is a stone cold killer. He's an autocratic leader who stifles any kind of dissent, and if that doesn't work, kills it.
Kills him.
Look at Navalny. He killed Navalny. You can say what you want. He poisoned him. He threw acid on him. He jailed him 19 times. He put him when he was in a weakened condition after a heart attack in a Siberian gulag until he died. And then when his wife bitched about it, he's now charged her with treason.
She's not living in the country, as but yes, she's now charged with treason. Right?
He is a absolute autocrat. He's a stone cold killer. I wouldn't wish him on my worst enemy. We have to disconnect this. You can think Joe Biden played this hand poorly and still understand it is our responsibility to hold people like Putin accountable. The world cannot exist with people like Putin and Xi acting like autocrats. Eventually, it will be on your doorstep.
And that's an important point because people say, I'm going to voice what we hear from some of our friends on the right. We can't be the world's policeman. Well, the problem is if we're not the world's policeman, I could say it's sheriff. Why sheriff? Because you're not walking the beat, but when there's a killer in town, you got to do something.
You get the posse together.
Yeah. That's what you got to do.
We can't be the world's policeman. That's why we need more cops on the beat. And NATO brings more cops on the beat.
Cops on the beat to the extent there is, and if there is no if the U.S. doesn't take some role in terms of enforcing the most basic of laws or less basic of laws, nobody else will, and that means the criminals, the gangsters like Putin, will rule the world. And you have to say. Some people say, I don't care. We got two oceans to us, and, I'm not worried about the Canadians and the Mexicans. Who cares? I think that's a hard argument to make convincingly because if that's the case, there was no need for World War II. There was no need for a Cold War. We might as well have just let the world go to hell.
Cliff, I just want to associate myself fully with what Mark to say. I think he said it beautifully about just kind of bringing some moral and strategic clarity to who Putin is and how we should respond. And any arguments that some of our friends on some parts of the right might be hearing, trying to blame NATO for Ukraine. just are ridiculous and don't stand up to scrutiny. And if you want more information on that, I'd encourage your listeners, Cliff, to listen to the episode you allowed me to guest host late last year with ASD Celeste Wallander, where she ran down in detail, really impressive detail, just demolishing that argument that NATO is to blame for what Putin has done. So I'd encourage folks to check that out if you're interested in hearing more on that. And then lastly, just a lot of folks, including me, have said that and you've heard me say this before as well, Cliff, that the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan was likely on Putin's mind when he made his decision about what he was going to do in Ukraine. Hard to prove, but it seems reasonable. And so anyone on the right who's making that argument, who's then saying, maybe we should support Ukraine, maybe we shouldn't. Well, apply the same logic that you are with Afghanistan to Ukraine and Taiwan, right? If we fail to stand with Ukraine and we have some sort of a Russian victory in Ukraine, then Xi's going to conclude, he's more likely to conclude that he can accomplish his political objectives in Taiwan with military force because, now follow the logic here and scrutinize me if you want to, if we're not willing to spend 2.6% of what we spend on the Pentagon without putting a single U.S. service member in harm's way to help Ukraine with all the benefits I already laid out, then why the blank would Beijing conclude that we're going to send hundreds or thousands of Americans to fight and die in the Taiwan Strait? So if we can't even spend 2.6%, why are we going to do that? And that and this isn't Risk or Stratego, sports fans. This is life and death, the worst war potentially of this century. And all we have to do is keep spending about 2.6%, giving the Ukrainians the baseball bat over the back fence so they can brutalize the home invader so he doesn't invade our home next. And you don't have Beijing, Tehran, Pyongyang saying, hey, those Americans really are all show and no go. So here we go. Game on in our region.
The worst part is if we decide we are going to fight, now we've deterrence has failed. Now we actually have to defeat them. And we're going to lose in a fight in Taiwan. We will lose anywhere from 10 to 30,000 Americans, depending how it plays out. And literally, you can deter that by building the capability and capacity you need, which Brad and I argue for pretty extensively in all our writings about how to spend our money right, and then showing that you'll credibly use that force to defend your interests. Capability plus credibility. You can't walk from Ukraine. If you do, you lose that. Then you just got your capability, which is your warfighting means. The worst thing we can do is walk from Ukraine and then fight Taiwan.
Right.
Because we're going to lose tens of thousands of Americans.
And then it's really over in terms of the decline of the U.S. as the leader of the free world or the existence of a free world.
And Cliff, a lot of the listeners might appreciate taking the logic behind what Mark just said and apply it to the Middle East. In the Middle East, America, when it wants to be, is the most muscular combatant in the region. I mean, we can flow in combat power unlike any military in the history of the world. But in the Middle East, Iran is on the march. Why? They know that we can kick their butts anytime we want to, but they're not afraid because they think this administration is afraid to throw a punch. So if you buy that logic in the Middle East, which is empirical and accurate and defensible, then why would you not buy it in the context of Ukraine and Taiwan, as we just argued? You have to have both the capability and the perceived willingness to use that capability. If you don't have both, you're going to get more aggression up.
You only had to strike us 158 times before we did something about it, right? That's how many times IRGC-backed proxies in Syria and Iraq struck at U.S. forces before finally on number 159, they killed 3 Americans. And we said, all right, now we're going to strike you.
Yeah.
I mean...
Yeah. Well, I think, and I don't go too far into this, but Obama had this idea that he was a sort of Metternichian figure who could come up with a balance. The Iranian regime would like it. They'd like him because, after all, he's dark-skinned. Don't Iranians like people with dark skin? Actually, do a little research on that. Well, but he's got a Muslim father. Yeah, but he's not a practicing Muslim. He didn't. Very faculty lounge kind of view of how the world works. And Biden, for the most part, has simply picked up the Obama ball on the Middle East and tried to run with it. Again, we probably give it $100 billion to the regime in Iran, which has been used for Hamas, for Hezbollah, for the Houthis. Still, they had a lot of money to spend on weapons for all these proxies that are killing Israelis. So I don't want to.
No, but let's say I say this: the game's up, the gig's up now. There's an alliance of 4 authoritarian states now: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And then there's the democratic West, however you want to call it, the alliance of democracies. It's NATO, it's us. Today, in NATO, this week, we've brought in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Korea so that we can work with them about how NATO is a bigger player in Europe, how those countries are a bigger player with Russia, Ukraine. I mean, how NATO's a bigger player in China, how they can play in this. I think we're coming together.
This is you jumped to something I wanted to get to, and I will, since you brought it up, even though I wanted to hit a couple other subjects first. And that is whether or not the alliance shouldn't really take into consideration the fact that the threat that Moscow represents is now firmly aligned with its big brother in Beijing and with the Islamic Republic in Iran, as well as North Korea, as well as Cuba, as well as Venezuela. And maybe that means there are structural differences. Just because we branded it as North Atlantic doesn't mean you can't have Japan and Australia join the military alliance. Alliances change, or should, to reflect the realities they see. And right now, with Japan, we are obligated to defend Japan. Japan's not obligated to defend us. Maybe it should be, just as all the NATO members under Article 5 are. The Australians, God bless them, they're with us in pretty much every war. Maybe they should be part of this alliance. Maybe it's more important to have them in the alliance than it is to have Canada in this alliance, or Spain in this alliance, or Turkey in this alliance. Do we really think Turkey is going to defend Lithuania? Do we really think Turkey is going to fight Russia if it's necessary? I'm maybe that we need some real structural changes to make this military alliance the strongest it needs to be for this century and the threats of this century, which are different than they were during the Cold War, or during Cold War 1.0, if you want to put it that way.
As usual, I need more time, Cliff. There's so much good there. But yeah, there, as all three of us know, there is no mechanism in the North Atlantic Treaty signed 1949, 75 years ago, in the very same room that a lot of the hooplas happened in this last week. There's no mechanism in the North Atlantic Treaty for evicting a member of the alliance.
It doesn't mean you can't change the rules at some point.
Right.
Country clubs do that.
Can't get him to add Hawaii to the
Hawaii. That's Hawaii is not protected.
Sure. I say go pursue whatever policy. But it reminds me a little bit of UN Security Council reform, right? The second you try to change it, someone used the veto. No, I don't really want to. I don't really want to be kicked off as a permanent member. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't try. But I would just highlight that in the summit declaration that I keep coming back to, it's the most forceful, and tell me, Mark, if you agree, it's the most formal statement from all 32 members of the alliance regarding China that I think we have seen. I'm reading from a quote right here. The PR, this is all 32 members of the alliance. And this is, a lot of people, it's diplomatic speak, who cares? But I mean, that's the beginning of good policy, is speaking the truth and then back it up with real muscle. The PR, here's the quote: the PRC has become a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine through its so-called no limits partnership and its large-scale support for Russia's defense industrial base. Those are very important words. And here's another one. This is a threat in Washington speak cocktail Davos land. This is pretty hard hitting here. Quote: the PRC cannot enable the largest war in Europe in recent history without this negatively impacting its interests and reputation. That's all 32 members talking. Now, and I can read the minds of a lot of people. Okay, that's nice. What comes next? But that's a good start, and that's clear speak. And that's on top of 3 million artillery shells coming from North Korea to Russia being used in Ukraine. That's on top of North Korean short-range ballistic missiles going from North Korea to Russia being used in Ukraine. Yeah. That's on top of Iranian drones. So what Mark said is so right. We really see this axis of aggressors coming together, not for cocktail parties, but literally sharing intelligence, sharing tactics, techniques, and procedures between their militaries, and sharing and supporting each other's defense industrial base, and sharing weapons for the purpose of directly supporting the largest invasion in Europe since World War II. And if that won't wake you up in Belgium, I don't know what will.
I would not be surprised if payback for the Shaheeds and that Iran has sent to Russia, and some ballistic missile parts as well, isn't going to be the Su-57, their latest fighter jet. And I got to tell you, the Israeli Air Force is the second best Air Force in the world, only behind the United States, and they can usually handle a lot of things. But you don't want to be handling a high-performance aircraft like an Su-57 after you've flown 12 hours or 10 hours or 8 hours to get there and refueled and all that. So I would just say gently that maybe it's 4 hours there, 4 hours back, but in any case, it's tough. Iran will benefit in its qualitative military comparison to Israel from its relationship with Russia. So we need to hold Russia accountable for this. We need to terminate this war on Ukraine's terms and put Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea back in their box.
So to terminate this war on Ukraine's terms, We know what that means from Zelensky. We know what the controversy has been. He, because this administration only wants, it seems, our allies to be on defense, and it's very hard to win a war strictly on defense. He said, okay, well, Biden has said, you're going to have these weapons, but you can't use them deep. You can't use them at all, initially against Russia, only on your territory. You can use them a little bit on their territory. And of course, what Zelensky wants to do is say, let me use weapons to hurt Russians, so Russians say, we need to end this war, as opposed to, nice night in Moscow, I'm going out to dinner, I don't have to worry about anything.
So here's a shocker. The crowd that brought us the cluster F of a withdrawal from Afghanistan, can't figure out how to do the support to Ukraine, correct? And I agree. Look, I give Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden and all the credit in the world for, one, doing all that intelligence release leading up to the invasion, so that we all understood what the hell was happening and the Europeans couldn't hide, right? And they didn't.
Okay.
And then, two, stepping right in and offering the military assistance using something called presidential drawdown authority, which got it there fast. Only we could have done that.
Okay.
At that point, we're the only country, and we did it. What is just unimaginable is the conditions that we've put on the delay in conditions we put on every major weapon system, starting with the guided missile launcher rounds, which were about 90-kilometer artillery pieces. Then the M1A1 tanks, if you remember the 8-month-long delay in those, the Abrams. Then the ATACMS for and eventually only sending them the shorter range cluster version, and only very, very recently sending the long ones, but still putting limitations on when they could fire them. And the F-16s, where we have been very slow in the agreement to do it, and then extremely slow in the training of pilots. I mean, I don't think the wing is going to really be ready, despite the announcements we'll hear this week. It's really not going to be ready till spring of 2025.
Okay, I agree with you, and here's what those who disagree with you would say, and it's a point that needs to be dealt with is, hey, Putin keeps saying, I have nuclear weapons, and I'm just crazy enough I might use them. Do you really want to take are you feeling lucky, sucker? Right? That's sort of what he's saying. Now, I think the problem with that is once you say anyone with nuclear weapons can deter us, we will always back down. You got years of backing down to do, not just from Russia, not just from China, also from North Korea, and probably eventually from Iran. And kind of then it's like over for U.S. primacy. And Pakistan, why not?
India.
Why not?
So listen, Brad's already deconstructed the provocation principle. So I'll just say again, you can't let a bully push around like this. If they were striking, they've used some of their home cooked drones to strike the airfields, and they had a great strike on an Su-57 set the other day, 2 planes the other day. But if they were able to use the ATACMS appropriately to hit logistics concentrations, to hit command and control networks at distance at 250, 300 kilometers, well out there, deep into Russia, they'd be in a much better, that would be a tactically enhancing asset that would have an operational value. In other words, it would actually change the arc of the battle in Kharkiv or the arc of the battle in Donetsk or in the Crimea. I really think, and when you think about deep into Crimea, how much damage they could do, how much they could really make it hard for Russia to effectively operate and control Crimea. And so, from my perspective, we need to loosen these binds. Look, you cannot let Russia operate with impunity right up to the border, and then say we'll handle you in that 7 kilometers between the border and Kharkiv. That just doesn't work. That's tactically impossible for the Ukrainians. And they almost lost big chunks of Kharkiv. Heroic ground fighting with a lot of casualties for 2 reasons. 1, the limitations of the Biden administration. 2, the delayed delivery of ammunition because of the delay in our $60 billion assistance package. Those 2 things combined to create the most stress that Ukraine has felt in nearly 2 years. I think we're through that now, and the Republicans did their job in the House and passed the $60 billion. The Biden administration has to stop, this behavior and provide the Ukrainians with the tactical equipment they need and the operational envelopes to employ them.
I've got like a dozen other subjects, but we're short on time, so I'm going to end with this. I think optimistic, and let you comment on it. One is we don't know exactly what Trump will do if he becomes the next president in regard to NATO. But the GOP platform, which is very Trumpian for good reason, does ensure that our military must be the most modern, lethal, and powerful force in the world. I agree with that. It also says, while starting with protecting the American homeland, our people, our borders, our great American flag, and our rights under God. I don't disagree with that, although I can see how one could interpret that as focusing more on Fortress America. But I think our argument is you focus on Fortress America by focusing abroad. One more point, Mike, and then I'll let you just say what you want to say to conclude. Wall Street Journal had high praise from Mike Johnson and the speech he gave the other day at a friendly think tank, Hudson Institute, and I quite agree with him. Just two quotes from Mike Johnson, which I was pleased to hear. He said, "Absent American leadership, we're looking at a future that could be defined by communism and tyranny rather than liberty, opportunity, and security." Exactly so. And then the other quote, which really sounded like he's been reading stuff from FDD. He said, "America is threatened by Chinese communists, by Russian oligarchs, and Islamic terrorists. We can choose to ignore them. We can try to appease them, or we can choose another course. We can rearm, rebuild, reinvigorate, restore, and reinstate fear in our enemies. Decline is always a choice. That is not a choice that Republicans will be making anytime soon." Boy, he kind of, good for Mike Johnson. He said,
as someone who used to spend a good chunk of my time writing speeches for senators, I admire the alliteration there with all the R's. Well done. Yeah. And there's actually real important ideas behind them. And that's exactly right. I would like to hear more of that from some folks.
If we do, maybe we get one more, we'll get reelect. Yeah. Johnson as the speaker. Who knows?
And I'm naive enough to think that's what a lot of Americans want to hear who are busy with their lives. And I always go back, bringing Afghanistan back to this. It always used to frustrate me that, you say, well, American people don't support doing this or that in Afghanistan. It's like, well, we had successive administrations of both parties that spent zero time explaining, and H.R. McMaster's made this point, explaining to the American people why we have interests there worth defending, worth sacrificing for, which, by the way, is disservice to the people making those sacrifices in Afghanistan when the commander-in-chief doesn't make that argument. So you don't make that argument. People busy paying the mortgage, raising their kids, don't have time to think about it. No one's telling them why. So then you do a poll. Should we leave Afghanistan? Of course we have. Because
it was not an issue that most people were seized by.
No, of course not. And making the leadership all the more important. And so my point here is when you have political leaders saying good things like that and explaining why what we have here is worth defending. If you're going to defend what we have here, you're going to have to go abroad. The great quote, "We go abroad, not abroad in search of monsters destroyed." Well, newsflash, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, COVID, things come here. Yeah. So we have to go abroad to defend ourselves here at home. That's just history 101. And when you have leaders saying things like that, I say, wonderful, give me more of that because it's supported by history. It's supported by any objective view of the geostrategic environment we confront in human nature. If you got something good, people are going to want to destroy it and take it. We got something good here. We got some allies that are willing to help us defend those good things. And we have adversaries that are more aligned than they've been since the 1950s. And, bravo to Johnson.
I agree with that. I like what Johnson said there. And I'll go further and say that I think that, President Trump, let's say President Trump's reelected. He should look at what's going on in Europe and say, I won.
Yeah.
They were spending, collectively, there were back then 6 or 7 countries spending the 2%. Now there's 23. Probably if you were to fast forward to the end of his second term, if he was reelected, it would be at 28 countries or 20. Now you add in the 2 others, Sweden and Finland gets you right up to 29, 30. You're at a very high number. And so, from my perspective, if the president looks at this, glass of water as half full, it's a very good story. They're much more capable. The money we're spending in Ukraine generally is going to U.S. states he likes as it happens. I just think this is a win. I hope he can take the win. Not, that's hard sometimes, but take the win. And oh, by the way, I don't believe any of this malarkey about, him being involved with Putin or anything like that. And if you think you take that off the table, he doesn't like, there's a difference between saying, I understand a strong man, I like people who make decisions well, and I like stone cold killers. I don't think, Trump's like trolling San Quentin looking for stone cold killers. And I don't think he looks at Putin and says, I inherently like that guy. I hope he can take the win here if he becomes president again, understand that NATO's a winner. And he's got, they did put in the guy they thought he got along with best, the Dutch Prime Minister.
Rutte.
Obviously, I guess they could have picked Orban to head NATO, but I'm joking there, but and Orban cleared him.
Yeah.
And my guess is Orban cleared him after talking to Trump. So they've got a leader that publicly shared some of the same, kind of like feelings Trump did. Now, his country was very slow to get to 2%. Dutch domestic politics, where they had no prime minister for almost 10 years at one point, 8 years at one point. They had this terrible system going on, explains a lot of that, not Rutte. So, my point is that I hope Trump takes the win if he becomes elected. If he doesn't and it's Biden, then I hope he strengthens his will on making these decisions fast.
If you want to make America great again, it's got to be the leader of the free world. And it's got to be seen as the leader of the free world, and the free world has to be seen as something real, something important, something that is a threat to the world, to the axis of tyrannies, as I started calling it, along with.
We need access to, we benefit when we have access to 75, 80% of the world's GDP.
Right.
We make money when goods are financed, when trades are financed, when goods are shipped, when things are insured. I mean, that is where we make a lot of our GDP. Information exchange, intellectual property dissemination, all that kind of stuff is how we make money. You don't make that money by sitting insularly in the United States and trading only with Canada and Mexico. That's not going to get you there. You have to have worldwide access. That's why we need large defense budgets, a strong Navy. That's why we have to sometimes take our army overseas and impose our will, against authoritarians who deny access, freedom, and liberty. And so, these are things that I think if you want to be a great country, exactly how you said, if you want to make America great again, Ronald Reagan understood this intrinsically. You've got to be able to project power effectively. And that's what, we've been arguing for. And I think NATO helps us.
Former President Trump and many of his followers, they admire strength and leadership. And I would say that are weak on NATO, that will be rightly perceived as weak. And so if President Trump in a second term and his followers want our country and him to be perceived as strong and a strong leader, I say the last thing you'd want to do is neglect our core interests in Europe, because you will create a strength and leadership vacuum in Europe and elsewhere that will not only make us look weak, which is not cool at the cocktail parties, but also informs war and peace decisions of our adversaries. So I'm all for looking strong. I want America to be strong, and I want us to lead, and I admire those who admire that. And failing to protect our core interests for our own sake as a wise investment, not charity in Europe, will make us look weak and will invite more war, not less.
Admiral Mark Montgomery, Brad Bowman, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for the work you do here. I'm proud to have you as colleagues. Thanks to all of you who have been with us for this conversation today here on Foreign Policy.